over your course of the time in Congress, is there something, the accomplishment that you're most proud of?
One of the things I'm most proud of is the setting up the constituent service department that we have. We've done an incredible amount of work helping people with federal agencies, whether it be the VA, Social Security, helping people with Service Academy nominations. So I was at a rally for Ted Cruz just before the election, and 3 people came up to me, and one said, "You don't remember me, but you helped me with the VA problem." Another one said, "You helped me with the Social Security problem." Another one, "You helped me, or you helped a neighbor get their child into West Point." So those are the things that, again, they don't make the screaming headlines, but a great deal of satisfaction with the constituent service department. Lake Lewisville has been a big part of my life. I mean, I've lived here in my entire life. Lake Lewisville has been a big part of my life. I was here when the dam was built that enlarged the lake. There is a lot of water infrastructure that is there that has allowed the growth of the Metroplex to be as robust as it has been, which couldn't have happened if the folks making the decisions back in the 40s and 50s hadn't seen to it that we would have the water resources necessary to run an enterprise as big as the DFW Metroplex. So I try to put some of that stuff in historical perspective. No, I didn't get a new lake, but a couple of years ago when the lake was under a serious threat and had not 1, not 2, but 3 seepage areas under an earthen dam that was 70 years old, yikes, that's potentially a big problem. So I didn't get a new lake built, but I kept you from losing your old one. I think that's pretty important. Water in this area is incredibly important. So, your question was, what are the things that are you're most proud of? The things that endure after, it's not the bill signing, it's not when the bill goes to the federal agency to be interpreted, but how has it impacted the lives of the people that you represented? So, no, I didn't get a new lake authorized and built, but I kept you from losing the old one, which was actually pretty important. We did a lot of work on the dam with operations and maintenance on the dam and fixing the 3 seepage areas that were occurring, putting the new spillway in. All of that is, that sort of, the permanence to that sort of infrastructure is to me what's important, because it's going to stay on much longer than people remember my tenure here. We got a big VA clinic built in Fort Worth, one of the biggest ones in the country. Got that up and running in 5 years' time, which was absolutely incredible when you think of the way the VA normally moves at a slower than glacial pace. And even the VA clinic up in Denton, which had been promised for years was going to be improved. I no longer have Denton in the district, but I did do the walkthrough of the new clinic earlier this year. And they finally have done a great job on getting those facilities up to date. And probably the biggest issue there is that veterans no longer have to walk across a very busy street to get from the parking lot to the clinic. It's all encompassed in one location. So those are the sort of things that they kind of stay with you as, that's gonna make a difference in people's lives long after I'm gone.
You said not a feeling of contentment now because there's still work to be done. Is there anything that you regret not being able to push across the finish line, or even a vote you took when you look back and you think, now with perspective, I feel a different way?
Not going to answer that question. But
Smart man.
Because no one remembers those votes but me. The things that I still have out there pending, the Preventive Health Savings Act, which has passed the House and is sitting over in the Senate. When you look at Robert Kennedy coming in as the head of HHS, and he talks about Make America Healthy Again, one of the tools he would have in the toolbox is that preventive health savings, which allows the Congressional Budget Office to do a longer look at things than the normal 10-year budget window. So a lot of talk now about the weight loss drugs and whether those should be available to people on Medicare. If you just look at that in a 10-year window, it's all just going to be cost. And people say, well, that's just too expensive. There's no reason you would want to do that. But if you take a longer look and look at the reduced rates of type 2 diabetes, look at the rates of reduced cardiovascular disease, the savings to the system may be significant in those out years. So the Preventive Health Savings Act, which allows the Congressional Budget Office a longer time frame than 10 years to look at the impact and the savings for preventive health items, that's a big one. I'd like to see that get through the Senate. I've also had a bill out there for some time that would allow, we all worry about consolidation in healthcare, and the doctors can no longer own hospitals because of something in the Affordable Care Act. That needs to be undone. There are plenty of rural areas in this state where physicians locally would probably welcome the opportunity to put a hospital together, but they're prohibited from doing that by federal regulation. And in no other business am I prohibited from undertaking that business because of my professional degree. I mean, it just makes no sense. So there is a way around some of the problems we have with access and again the work against consolidation. So allowing physicians to own hospitals again, I think would go a long way towards doing that. And again, that bill is out there. It's kind of hung up in the Senate. I've got another bill that would allow physicians who've left the workforce to come back in. We talk about we're going to have too few physicians in the future, but these are all concepts that are out there and they're available for other people to work on if they don't get done this year. The Senate has been unbelievably slow on some of these. And look, I'm not kidding myself. They've got so much work to get done before the end of the year. The House still has, but the Senate has done nothing on all of the appropriations work. So it's the hill to climb is daunting.
You mentioned RFK. How do you feel about his nomination to lead healthcare in this country?
Well, I don't think anyone really appreciates just how big the agency is that he's going to undertake to lead. So the concerns I have there are not, they're the concerns about can anybody lead an 85,000 person agency when most of the people who work in that agency actually don't work for you. So they're career employees. And this is what Tom Price found out several years ago when he, as a physician, was named to the head of HHS. It is a mammoth agency with an incredible reach. If I were in charge of the office that's going to be looking at efficiency in the federal government, that is one of the places where I would spend a vast amount of my time because the agency is so enormous that it's almost, we talk about things that are too big to fail. This is too big to work. And as a consequence, you see the suffering that is borne by patients who are not properly taken care of by Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance, which is also regulated under HHS, and particularly sensitive to the docs, to the provider side, who have endured just incredible reimbursement cuts every year of the Biden administration. Granted, the increases during the Trump administration were pretty small, but does not even compare to the reductions in reimbursement that have occurred every year of the Biden administration. And at the same time, in those 4 years, you had incredible increases in inflation. And so the cost of running a practice just really can't be covered by what the reimbursement rates are now. We're going to lose doctors and nurses from the Medicare system if we're not careful here. And I hope the attention of the people coming in is properly placed on taking care of patients, making sure the providers are there to take care of the patients. At the same time, let's back off on some of the incredible regulatory regimen that is, if you stamp medicine on something, it's going to become much more expensive and much more difficult to implement because of the regulatory structure behind it. So RFK Jr. has an enormous task ahead of him. My worry is not so much of what he might do, but just how difficult a task he has in front of him. And everyone in that agency feels that they have the most important job in the system, and there's going to be a lot of resistance to any type of reform that he wants to enact.
I'm curious, so it sounds like you're more concerned about the position itself versus the man or woman who would be nominated to it. Does anything about his stance on vaccines or anything like that give you pause to put him in a position like that?
He's told me personally that he's not anti-vaccine, and I'll take him at his word on that. look, he's got to go through the confirmatory process in the Senate, but there are perhaps other individuals that are going to command a lot more in the way of headlines, so maybe he's going to be fortunate there. All of Trump's nominations, and I don't really have a problem with any one of them, but they all have to go through the confirmatory process that the Constitution directs.
Let's talk about what you've experienced in D.C. How different is Congress now versus when you arrived?
Well, a lot of it is very similar, because when I arrived, the first thing I faced as a brand new freshman was I had to vote on a big funding bill because the last Congress hadn't finished its work. So I hope we don't do that to the incoming administration and the incoming Congress. But there's certainly a risk there. I think one of the biggest things I've noticed over the last 4 years, and I don't mean to be just political and picking on the outgoing administration, but it has been impossible to get a phone call answered by an agency head. And it just shouldn't be that way. Some of it actually goes back to how we've funded government recently. When I first got there, the House went through every one of its 12 appropriations bills. They were heard on the floor of the House. They were open rules. Anybody could come down and offer as many amendments as they wanted. In fact, as soon as the budget was passed in March of my first year, Tom DeLay, who was then majority leader, said, I want you to get ready. We're going to be up here 5 days a week. We're going to work late nights. Just be ready for it. Don't be surprised by it. It's part of what happens during appropriations time in the House. So that's what I the system that I entered into. Now, the Democrats changed all of that after they took the majority in 2007 and 2008, did away with the open rules part, which has never come back, which I think is unfortunate, but also more and more in the habit of doing some big continuing resolution or omnibus funding bill at the end of the Congress when we're up against a deadline. And the problem there is the agency heads now, they're disconnected from where does their money actually come from. Well, it comes from Congress. It comes from the People's House. So when a member of Congress calls you on the telephone, you ought to pick it up and talk to them and hear what their concerns are. For the last 4 years, I have not been able to get a phone call answered from any agency head in the Biden administration, and that's just wrong. It just shouldn't be that way.
That's very frustrating, I would imagine. Talk to me about the Texas delegation. You just mentioned rules. We are losing power because you are no longer going to be there, so the Rules Committee will not be chaired by a Texan. Appropriations. We've lost so much tenure, it feels like. What does the Texas delegation look like now compared to when you entered? And do you worry at all that we're losing, like I said, the power and the tenure that really does matter in Congress?
Sure, but 5 years ago, I don't remember what it was, we lost 5 or 6 Texas chairmen in one election cycle because Jed Hensarling and Lamar Smith didn't run for re-election. Michael Conway retired that year. So there was a big turnover 5 years ago. And we recovered from that. And it will, that's the normal process of things. Remember, on the Republican side, we're term limited to 6 years as chairman or ranking member of a committee. The bad news is if you're a chairman, you're not going to be able to be chairman for long. The good news is for people coming up, it provides them opportunities. The Texas delegation is the largest Republican delegation in the House of Representatives. We do have significant power. The key there is recognizing that we do have significant power and all staying together on issues. That's more difficult now. When I first got there were only 15 Republicans. Even though Republicans were in the majority, we were in the minority as a state delegation. Now it's 25 Republicans, I think, on the House delegation. So it's much larger and a lot of very, very active people in the delegation. So it's a little harder to get everybody on the same page, perhaps as it was when I first started, but it's still possible. And Texas, I hope, will be able to recognize the power that it does have if it's willing to stay together and stay organized. I promise you that other delegations recognize the power of the Texas delegation, and they go out of their way to minimize the power of the Texas delegation because Texas is so powerful.
Have you spoken to your successor about that, or have you given him any advice?
Oh, sure. We've had a lot of conversations, and look, he will make his own way. He'll create his own story in Congress. when I first got there in 2003, I'm sure a lot of people were scratching their heads wondering how in the world did this guy get there, and I don't expect much out of him. And then I hope I've been able to show over the next 22 years that it was a good idea to send me. I think same will be true of Brandon Gill after his tenure is examined.
One of very few doctors in Congress you've been. I read in an interview you did with Dallas Morning News that you've said you'd hate for all your knowledge of healthcare policy and things to go to waste. So what does come next for you?
You know, I don't know. The other way I think I phrased it was my encyclopedic of healthcare information, encyclopedic knowledge of healthcare information. But it's, I've certainly tendered my resume to the incoming administration. If they find that I could be helpful somewhere, I certainly want to talk to them. But I'm sure there'll be a number of opportunities on the outside from the private sector, people who are interested in how things happen. You know, one of the things that just really astounded me that I didn't know before I got to Congress is it's one thing to have a great idea and then be able to convince everybody else in the House you've got a great idea and then pass the bill, and then you got to get over to the Senate, and with the current filibuster rules you got to get 60 senators, so it tends to make things more bipartisan. Well, that's all well and good, but if you stop your thinking at I've got a great idea and I want to get it passed in committee, or even I want to get it passed in the House, that's a dead end. You're going to have to get it passed by both the House and the Senate. You got to think about the signing of the bill because the president is going to have to sign the bill, and then you've got to do the follow through when it gets to the federal agency. There are any number of bills that I could point to you that congressional intent, perhaps the best of congressional intent, was not mirrored by the people at the agency who then write the rules for the implementation. So the biggest one in recent memory was the No Surprises Act, a bill which I voted against because it was right at the end of the Trump administration last time, and you didn't know who in the world was coming in to HHS as secretary the next time. So I was concerned about I thought we got a good bill by all of the attention that we put to it on the House side, but I wasn't sure what was going to happen at the agency. And turns out I was correct. They completely ignored congressional intent. Texas Medical Association has sued them 4 times, successfully. But still, now 4 years and some later, we're still waiting on the implementation of some of that because it was such a bad job by the federal agency. So there's any number of times where the agency's action after Congress has passed something have really not mirrored congressional intent. So when I talk to people about this, it's not just, hey, I've got a great idea and I'd like to see this turned into law. You've got to follow it all the way through and then some. So one of the biggest downsides is the committee of jurisdiction that did the bill needs to have the proper oversight or even just implementation hearings afterwards. And again, sometimes those are hard to get scheduled because committee time is limited. And hey, we did that last Congress, we want to move on to other stuff. But you can't take your eye off the ball. When things go to the agency, they can get incredibly garbled.
Speaking of that, I'm curious your take, and of course this is a state law, not federal law, so you haven't worked on it, but there's been a lot of criticism about the way that the Texas abortion ban is written. Do you feel as though there's enough clarity for people who are in the profession that you spent decades in, for defenders? Is there enough clarity on when an abortion can be performed in this state?
Well, there is a definitional issue there. I don't think it should be hard to treat a miscarriage. I mean, unfortunately, 15% of pregnancies end in a miscarriage, and it's hard enough going through a pregnancy. It's hard enough losing a pregnancy. It's hard enough practicing medicine as it is without it being made more difficult. But at the same time, while I want there to be I don't want there to be any question. A doctor in an emergency room who is presented with a patient undergoing a miscarriage who feels that they need to be treated, they should be treated. There shouldn't be any question about it. So I do think there are perhaps some areas where a little more clarity or a little more certainty would make a difference. Because practicing medicine is hard. We shouldn't, by our public policy, we shouldn't make it harder. At the same time, I mean, I'm pro-life. Let there be no mistake about that. I think we are a better country without, you know, when I think of the days prior to the Dobbs decision, I mean, follow the money. Planned Parenthood made an incredible amount of money off of terminating pregnancies, and that's not a good look for the country. And even other countries that put limits there, their limits are quite low. We had no limits in this country, and that was wrong. It cheapened life in this country, and I think we're a much better country than that.
We all heard last night that President Biden decided to go ahead and pardon his son, Hunter Biden. Your reaction to that, were you surprised? Did you expect that to happen even though the president had said he wouldn't do it?
I think we all knew something was going to happen at some point. Maybe the timing surprised me a little bit. But look, anyone who's been a son, anyone who's been a father recognizes that, you know, was not completely unexpected. I think the thing that bothers me about it is that there are people sitting in jail today, or people who have convictions on their record who were found guilty of exactly the same thing, of which Hunter has now been found guilty, and the fact that now just goes away. Do we need to look at other convictions that have happened? I mean, how many times did President Biden get in my face and say people just need to pay their fair share of taxes? Dude, look in your own family. I mean, come on. It's one thing to say it to the country at large, but walk the walk here. So that aspect bothers me, but I will say from a standpoint, do I ever wish I'd had a dad who could have gotten me out of any fix I got myself into? Yeah, I understand that.
Sure, there's a lot of Americans who would agree with you on that. Final thing I'll ask you is, I think Congress must teach some lessons. It must give you perspective and wisdom. Is there anything you feel like you have learned in Congress that the rest of us could learn from you about? Some sort of perspective or wisdom that could really help the rest of us in daily life?
Well, let me just speak to the House side, because that's what I know the best, having never served in administration, having never served in the Senate. But the House of Representatives, 435 individuals who all go to their constituents in their district and seek election. And I think people would be most surprised at how many just regular people are there. How many just regular people are working through the problems that where they want their voices heard. I mean, you see the same people on television over and over again, and you think, oh my gosh, is that really the best we could do? But do bear in mind, behind the scenes, there are a lot of just genuine folks who are working on these problems, and they're not the ones you see on television every night. There are people who've put their careers and their families on hold for a while to go up and do the nation's business, which is what the founders intended at the beginning. The world is vastly different today than it was when the country was founded, but at the same time, the system works incredibly well when you think what it could have been. This summer, I had an opportunity to go to Canada with the Rules Committee, and we were invited to see the question period in the House of Commons, and it was interesting to watch the Prime Minister, I guess the equivalent of our president, be questioned by the rank and file members, and it wasn't a whole lot different from what I might see in the House of Representatives. We don't do that particular format, but it was an interesting distinction, but also it's the same concept. It's just regular people who are chosen by their districts, their constituents, to go and represent them. Ultimately, that's what we all want. We want good representation for our member when they're there in Washington. We don't necessarily want to see someone on television every night.
And sometimes it's the people just doing the hard work that are getting things done and not necessarily in the limelight.
Your words, not mine.